What's up, everybody? This is a video I've been wanting to do for a long time, but it's one thing to have an overall big picture in your head, and then another thing to break it down into its key components to where somebody else can understand it. So I'm going to rely on the help of some scholars to set the overall tone here, and we'll combine that with everything else I've been talking about for years on this channel. But I want to start with another subject I've wanted to talk about for a long time, but don't know how, and that's the noble Knights Templar. Now, as you will see in this video, it was the Church of Rome that basically invented the whole idea of academia in the 1400s, and the Knights Templar is one of their own, so of course they're going to get great coverage, right? You'll never hear anything negative about the Church of Rome throughout all history and up till today. Even Hollywood doesn't disrespect them. They have the best PR team in history. So, of course, they're always referred to as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. There's a clue for you. But from humble beginnings, they became a powerful international finance and military force. The way they always describe this is, well, they would just help the pilgrim travelers and they could deposit their money with them and then pick it up wherever they're going. And I'm guessing there's a fee for this service, but that never really gets mentioned. So while they weren't actually the first bankers, they were pioneers in creating large-scale cross-border financial networks with advanced record keeping and financial services like loans. That's close enough for me. Then, as the story goes, King Philip IV of France sent out sealed letters, sealed instructions to everyone to round everybody up on Friday, October 13th, 1307. Now, that could be apocrypha, but what always accompanies that story is that Philip had borrowed a bunch of money and didn't want to pay it off like a good king should, so he had all of them sent to the father. Now, I don't have anything to back this up, it's just pure intuition. I think there could have been some unfair usury being practiced on the people of France, and King Philip put a stop to it. What I can show you is the exact same thing happening in Britain, I think around 1200. But the bottom line here is that put a stop to international finance, right? This is just the way the story always goes. The usury gets put to an end, and then a generation or two goes by and everybody thinks, oh, it wasn't that bad, and it slowly crawls its way back up through the ranks. So they say the Knights Templar was disbanded in 1307. And then you had the 1300s catastrophes that I'm always talking about, which academia ignores and just says it was the Black D in 1348. What exactly happened at that time, I guess, can be debated, but what nobody is denying is that a huge portion of the population didn't make it through that. So Europe was decimated and whole sections of towns were left empty. So this is the world that Cosimo de' Medici was born into. And the overall Medici family is the Jorge Soros / Red Shields of the Renaissance, which makes them the gatekeepers of ancient history. And just like any major donor to a university today, they're going to have a say in what gets taught there. Only Cosimo's got the best racket ever. Now, here's what they say about all this, is the Western world didn't have any surviving texts from the ancient Greeks. But the Greek texts had been translated into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, and then later translated into Latin during the Renaissance. And that was actually one of the first huge red flags that I found when I was starting here. When I heard that they were translating into Latin, I was like, wait a minute, that was a dead language for 700 years, but allegedly the church kept it alive when no one else did. So you could say that Cosimo is part of Generation Alpha right after the 1300s catastrophes. This is literally the first generation of our modern world. But Cosimo plays a huge role in these texts being, quote, rediscovered. And some of these texts, like Plato's Republic, just happen to line up perfectly with his worldview of humanism. Now, they swear up and down that he wasn't a gray because he was Catholic. Here they say he was influenced by gray financiers. But once you hear the story here, you're going to think, he was really influenced, and possibly a crypto that basically infiltrated and took over the Church of Rome. Now, I know a lot of people hear the 1300s and think Vikings from the TV show or something. This is closer to 1850s New York, only with a lot more old world class than Hollywood's medieval peasants. So I'm going to set the stage for you here. The Santa Maria del Fiore, the big cathedral we're looking at here, began before the Catastrophes. And apparently the people that intended to build it didn't survive because it sat empty for like 80 years. Florence was the new Rome after all that. And the way I look at it is it was pretty much right after all that, but that's for another time.
For a long time, Florence was just an obscure market town on the banks of the River Arno in the heart of Tuscany. But from the 12th century onwards, it underwent this explosive growth. And that was because of two things. One was cloth and the other was credit. So cloth, it's basically wool. And it's imported from across Europe, but especially from England. And then when it gets to Florence, it's kind of processed and turned into cheap cloth. And about a third of Florence's population works in cloth factories on all this.
So England is basically Florence's India.
Yes, I guess so. That's a nice comparison. And then they take the money, they get the profits from all this, and they use that to kickstart a financial revolution. So this is the other thing, which is credit. So the Florentines start doing things like they use Arabic numerals instead of kind of Roman numerals. And Arabic numerals make it easy to do complicated calculations like interest payments because they have the concept of zero. They're also using paper rather than parchment.
So that's also been introduced by the Arabs, hasn't it?
Exactly. And paper is about half the cost of parchment. So I know this is a very strange thing to say, but they lead the world in bookkeeping and accountancy because they've got this cheap paper and they've got these nice new numerals.
Okay, so like I was saying about 1850s New York, sweatshops popping up, they say like the India of today. And just like cotton was shipped to New York from the South, everything was shipped to Florence where their industry center was. Then the Western world was introduced to Arabic numerals and new finance and bookkeeping methods that simplified accounting such things as interest. And it sounds a lot like the beast system came to Florence about this time.
You never think about in Renaissance Florence, there would have been thousands of slaves. And these slaves were usually young girls or young women, Greeks, Turks, Circassians from the Caucasus. And it was very, very common for these rich Florentine bankers to have slave girls with whom they would sleep, actually, sort of.
See, back then, they just did this out in the open.
And power, again, interestingly, resides with the mercantile elite, not the old landowning nobility. The landowning nobility are formally excluded from power. So the way the elections work is very complicated. Basically, you have to belong to one of these trade guilds, and every 2 months there is an election. And it's not an election where you...
So they're transferring power from the landowning nobility to the merchant class. Seems like I've heard this somewhere before. And by the way, the whole creation of the idea of a republic or a democracy is because no matter how much money you have, you will never be of a noble lineage unless you're born that way. So the mercantile class could never be nobility.
They sort of boast, we bring up our children not to hunt and to hawk. This is a bit of an exaggeration, by the way, but to fill in ledgers and to do sums and to make money because that's the sinews of our power. And they love all this kind of stuff.
That's why the Great Dome of the Duomo is the perfect symbol.
So they swear he's not, but okay.
Exactly. Now, by the time Cosimo is born in 1389, there are definitely tensions emerging. Number one, there's a big gap between rich and poor. The super rich, the people in the palazzi, and the masses, textile workers in the slums. Number two, rather like Rome, actually, Florence has expanded and it's swallowed up neighboring towns like Arezzo or San Gimignano.
So that's the territory rather than...
So it sounds like they were bringing in workers from all around, big divide between the rich and the poor. One more thing about them, and then we'll move on.
So they were initially economic migrants from a place called the Mugello, which is the sort of hills north of the city. And they'd probably moved to Florence in about the 12th century. They're famous for their coat of arms, which is red balls on a field of gold. And their supporters would often go into the streets and shout, balls, balls, in excitement.
Yeah, I bet they did.
Now, some people think the balls are kind of apothecaries' pills or cups linked to the surname of the family, Medici, which means medics, doctors. It could be pawnbrokers' balls. We don't really know, but either way, it's a reminder of their humble origins. And the humble origins are a standing affront to the old families of Florence, who even centuries later see the Medici as upstarts and parvenus and vulgar and whatnot. Anyway, over time, they've worked their way up the ladder. They're a respectable family who make their money from banking. And by the time Cosimo is born in the late 1380s, they've got branches in Florence, in Rome, in Venice, in Genoa, in Naples, and so on. As a result of their wealth and their success, they now have a little bit of political clout. And they are, Medici relatives are often appearing in the lists of people who've been elected to the Signoria, to the council.
Okay, let me just point out a few things here. De Medici, medic, doctor. Well, being a doctor was a popular profession of Greys in the Middle Ages. He also says that the balls could have represented pawnbrokers, and, well, then the fact that they're bringing a bunch of stuff from the East, like Arabic numerals, and as you will see, these lost Greek texts that have been translated into Arabic. Well, the Islamic world and the Greys tended to get along throughout history. So they swear that this isn't a Grey family, but it sure does sound like it. So now let's talk about some of their role in history. Eventually, 4 popes would come from this family. Cosimo came of age around the early 1400s, and it wasn't until 1513 before one of them became pope, but I think that was because Cosimo famously taught his son to rule from the shadows, basically. Was famously low-key about his power and wealth and would ride around town on a humble donkey. But this guy's the OG godfather that called the shots from the back room. During his life, he helped to get Baldassar Cosa elected to pope. Cosa was actually a pirate before that, and he's got the best villain name in history, Baldassar Cosa. But Cosimo financed his political rise and therefore reaped the benefits. They call him an anti-pope here because, well, everybody was arguing about who the real pope was for a long time at this time. When I say Cosimo is like the godfather, I mean that in every way possible. These are rich, powerful Italian families vying for control of their local cathedral. There was basically open warfare in the streets between them and the Albizes at times. The only difference between the priesthood and the mafia is the family that got the priesthood had more political clout and a bigger army than the other guy. The Medicis got chased out of Florence at one time, and it caused their economy to crash because they were so intertwined with the local economy.
So he expands the bank across Europe. So there are representatives, the list of cities: London, Naples, Cologne, Geneva, Lyon, Basel, Avignon, Bruges, Antwerp, Lubeck, Ancona, Bologna, Rome, Pisa, Venice. There are Medici representatives and Medici branch offices everywhere. And they can source relics, silk, manuscripts, choir boys, you name it, they can deliver it.
So just imagine all these guys rolled into one. But what was interesting there is he brought up the manuscripts that he would import. Now, the church at this time was ultra conservative. All they wanted people to know was the Bible and nothing else. Then opposite of them was the humanist movement. And the Medicis were playing both sides of the fence, just like left, right, liberal conservatives today. The humanist movement wanted all things Rome. They even wanted to worship the ancient Roman gods, which is heresy according to the church. And Petrarch is called the father of humanism, who we'll talk about in just a second. But the crazy thing is by the 1300s, this had been Visigoth, Goth, then Lombardy area for 700 years. Allegedly, Germanic tribes had come down and taken over all throughout the Dark Ages. Then all of a sudden in the 1300s, everybody wants to be Roman again. This would be kind of like the people of Mexico City today reverting back to the gods and ways of the Aztecs. It's just very strange that all this pops up out of the blue, right? So let me introduce you to some of the key players on the Medici team here. One is Francesco Petrarca, or just Petrarch, and they say that his work helped to inspire Cosimo's humanism movement here. Though he died before Medici's peak influence began, later the Medici, particularly Lorenzo, actively promoted Petrarch's legacy by elevating him alongside poets like Dante and Boccaccio. So his fame and importance grew through the following centuries thanks to the Medici's patronage of the arts. And as you will see with a lot of these guys, they were extremely fortunate to have rediscovered all of these ancient works. Petrarch's rediscovery of Cicero's letters is often credited with the initiating of the 14th century Italian Renaissance and the founding of Renaissance humanism. Let me put this into perspective for you. The Church of Rome is basically in charge of Christendom at this time. They're even saying that no, kings don't have the right to divine rule unless ordained by us. There's no such thing as nations at this time. Nobody has a concept of Italians. It's Romans, Florentines, Venetians, and each one has a king. But the church is present in and central to all of these cities, so they have enormous power. And like I said, all they want taught is the Bible. You don't need anything else. So if, as an intellectual, you pop on the scene and you start talking about the worth and dignity of the individual, not the grace of God, the use of reason and science to understand the world, not the word of God himself in the Bible, and a belief in human responsibility, not salvation through the blood of Christ, then you're going to have the Inquisition beating your door down. So one tactic you might use to promote these ideas is by saying that, oh, this is a 1,000-year-old document. Yeah, we just discovered a bunch of old Arabic texts, so here, it's all right there. So where did these come from?
When he was in his late 20s, there was an inventory of his house, and the books were things like Cicero, Julius Caesar, Virgil, Martial, Ovid, Tacitus. And she says, it's a big library for the period by any standards, but very unusual for somebody who's in their late 20s and is basically a banker, not a scholar.
And Dominic, can I just pick up on that list? Tacitus, I mean, he has only just been discovered. So we know that Boccaccio, the great 14th century Florentine writer, is reading Tacitus, but nobody else really knows about him. So for Cosimo to have Tacitus, he's amazingly cutting edge. I mean, it's kind of almost avant-garde in his tastes.
Yeah.
Okay, you can hear that this guy's surprised that Medici would have all of this in his library. The other guy is quoting a work by a recent scholar, but it is amazing, as in untenable, that this guy would have had all of that at that early period. But now let me read you what Fomenko writes about Petrarch. I may have to do a whole video on this because it's a pretty long section, but Fomenko's the Russian historian, mathematician, that is the true basis behind the 1,000 years getting added to the calendar, but everybody on the internet tended to forget about him and just say, well, they used an I on the dating. But no, this is where it all actually came from. According to our reconstruction, the classical age, which is the Roman era, is merely another name applied to the Scaligian chronology of the medieval epoch of the 11th to 15th centuries. Petrarch had visited the Italian Rome in 1337, saying, "Rome seemed even greater to me than I could have imagined, especially the greatness of her ruins." Petrarch had been met with an utter chaos of legends, from which the poet had selected the ones he considered to fit his priori opinion of the greatness of Italian Rome. Apparently, Petrarch had been among those who initiated the legend of the great ancient Italian Rome without any solid basis. A significant amount of real medieval evidence of the correct history of Italy in the Middle Ages was rejected as erroneous. So it sounds a lot like Petrarch visited the magnificent ruins of Rome and thought, oh, what legendary men must have built this, and helped initiate the legend of the great ancient Italian Rome without any solid basis. Now, notice how here he keeps referring to it as the Italian Rome. That's because, according to Fomenko, it was the early 14th century, the 1300s, that the small Italian town of Rome was officially decreed on paper to be the capital of the great ancient Rome. To this end, the events which had really occurred in a completely different Rome, the Rome on the Bosphorus, which is Constantinople, were transferred to the Italian Rome, again, only formally on paper. So, a large part of Constantinople's history is now attributed to the Italian Rome. That is a whole big discussion on its own. But that is the Petrarch and Medici that laid the foundations that would be built into the legend of ancient Rome. Another friend of the Medici family is Gemistos Platon, who just happens to rediscover the old writings of Plato. Platon, Plato. And he inspired Cosimo to found the Platonic Academy of Florence. This led to the translation of Plato's works and a new enthusiasm for Platonic philosophy that significantly influenced the arts and culture of the era. Even the whole idea of an academy or academia comes from these texts translated from Arabic into Greek. So all of these ideas that underpin Western society, we're really just taking somebody's word on it that these were ancient Greek texts and somebody didn't think them up in the East. So just keep that in mind here.
So basically, he has to lend the city, his own city, loads of money, and he takes home 14,000 florins in interest. So it's worked out splendidly for him. So I think this is a perfect example of the fusion of politics, finance, of religious faith, and culture that powers the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance. So first of all of these scholars from Constantinople, they have turned up with loads of Greek manuscripts that they're going to quote from in these debates. So their bags are kind of bulging with manuscript rolls or whatever.
This is when Plato really gets reintroduced. There's Plethon, this guy who actually he doesn't even approve of Christianity. He wants to go back to worshipping the ancient gods. And he brings Plato in Greek and he sets up a school there. And this is where Plato really becomes part of the bloodstream of the Renaissance.
People become very excited about Plato in Florence. They're like, oh, wow, this is amazing, all this stuff. And actually, some of these manuscripts end up in Cosimo's library. I think they're given as presents or he buys.
So about a month ago, I've got 2 videos back to back how the comrade ideology infiltrated our university system. And comradism is just an evolution of humanism. And the insidious genius of all of this is they are good causes. They are sound principles. Of course, I believe in liberty and equality. But did you guys know that those are Masonic ideas popularized during the French Revolution? So these are basically good principles that ultimately, though, lead to societal decay, which is another long conversation. But there you go. I'm showing you guys the birth of the modern world here. It started with Florence. And the way I kind of think of things is if you guys have heard me tell the story of Rome flooding, like up over the walls and the city was just absolutely destroyed. Well, I think Rome became uninhabitable and everybody migrated up to Florence and over to Venice. And Florence became the cultural capital, while Venice really became the mercantile capital because Venice became the biggest navy in the Mediterranean. They controlled all of the shipping. But one thing's for sure, usury and industry and all of the tools of Mordor came to Florence in the 1300s. And the Medici family became very rich, powerful, international financiers. And as megalomaniacs do, they wanted to shape the world in their image. But they had the advantage of 1,000-year-old lost texts that nobody's ever heard of before. Then they started the Humanist movement that inspired all of the art for the Renaissance. So this is how we get our idea of the ancient world. There, I think I made it fairly clear. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.